Today we're going to talk about one of the most notorious prisons in America. It's known across America because of many significant people and events that is directly related to the history of Rahway State Prison. In 1901, President William McKinley was assassinated, and on September 14th, Theodore Roosevelt took the oath of office, and at 42 years old, he became the youngest president in American history. That same year, Rahway opened its doors as New Jersey's first reformatory for youth. It was built on 21 acres and surrounded by 1,000 acres of farmland that was worked by the inmates. This, of course, was by design, as you can imagine the demographic of the landowners that were used to free labor. It started off with false intentions to provide training for jobs for those behind the walls, but over the years it developed into something else. Starting in the 1920s, other youth reformatories such as Annandale and Bordentown were built, and Rahway changed from a youth reformatory to a prison for adult males. In April 1952, in a response to ill treatment, the prisoners took officers hostage during a riot. They were rebelling against treatment which included the parole system, and they wanted the warden to lose his job. The prison operators immediately cut off the food and water supply, and after a few days, the riot ended as inmates suffered from hunger and thirst.
There is no way for a fellow who is incarcerated in one of our institutions in communicating his grievances to the man up front, the man who sets the policy and operates these institutions.
In June 1966, a bartender and 2 customers became victims of homicide in a tavern located in Paterson, New Jersey. The next year, in '77, a well-known boxer by the name of Rubin "Hurricane" Carter and a man named John Artis were arrested and charged with the crime. They would go on to serve hard time in Rahway and fight for their freedom as they maintained their innocence against a racially corrupt justice system.
And that is part of my everyday life here. Brutality, humiliation. I realize that I am here in prison, but I committed no crime to be here in prison. The crime was committed against me. I refuse to be treated as a criminal. I refuse to be treated as a non-entity. I am somebody. I'm a human being.
Around 1969, at 22 years old, a man named James Scott was convicted of an armed robbery that happened a year earlier. James also ended up getting sentenced to hard time in Rahway. While serving time, he met Albert Dickens, who was already serving a 50-year sentence for his part in an armed robbery that was associated with the violent members of the New World of Islam. James would go on to meet Ruben while Ruben was serving a triple life sentence. Being around these type of influences, James was convinced to use his talents to train seriously and focus on boxing as a sport. In 1971, in the auditorium of Rahway, 250 inmates were watching a movie. During the movie, they created a commotion, and when the warden stepped in, they surrounded him and began to beat him into submission. Most of the 20 other guards ran for cover, and the takeover started. Although more than half the inmates were African American and most of the guards were Caucasian, the issue was deeper than race. Further dehumanizing of the inmates, the food, the healthcare, and a list of 30 other grievances having to do with their treatment behind bars. The takeover ended in 24 hours when they released the hostages, but after a dozen guards received injuries from fists and feet, chairs and stabbings.
Inmates all over the tiers.
They were running loose?
Yeah, they taking the keys from us. All the keys were taken.
And could you just briefly summarize exactly what you saw and what happened, if you could, please?
Approximately 10:30 last night, there was 250 men in the auditorium. They wouldn't leave. Mr. Vuck Savage, the warden, had tried to talk to him. They had told him that they were going to tear the prison apart. He had told them, you have too much to lose by doing this, and that's when it hit. They went crazy.
On August 11th, 1972, 3 convicted murderers somehow got the tools they needed to escape Rahway by sawing through the bars of a 3rd-floor window. 2 months after the escape, a 20-year-old man named Dwight Braxton would be arrested in October for an armed robbery of the Dreamers Lounge in New Jersey. He would then be convicted and sentenced to 5.5 years in prison. That prison would be Rahway. While in prison, he would become interested in the boxing program, and here is where he learned how to fight. Looking at the guys on the outside that were ranked in the World Boxing Association, he would say to himself, I could beat that guy.
When you come in, right, you have to even get adapt, all over. I don't know how many times you've been back here. You still got to get adapt all over again because it's unreal, it's unnatural. And when you come in, the cell closes, and you can't get up and just walk out when you want to. And then there's going to be moments when the thought's going to hit you. They tell you, keep your mind off the street.
He would go on to spar with James Scott and other inmates that were also good fighters, who fine-tuned their skills in Rahway. Dwight had a good head on his shoulders, and he was motivated by the horrible circumstances of the prison life, so he made a promise to himself: do the time and never come back to this place. Boxing wasn't the only talent that came out of Rahway. While on a visit to Rahway, a Motown artist and producer, George Kerr, heard some R&B voices that he knew were special. He got permission from the state and came back with a mobile studio and recorded an album by the Inmates, by the Escorts, which was released in 1973. In January 1974, James Scott was released from Rahway on a work parole program. He was paroled to Florida, where he could work with trainers from the 5th Street Gym in Miami, which just happened to be one of the gyms that Muhammad Ali used to train in. In early 1975, James was in his groove. He had won all his professional fights and was on his way to doing big things, but he was his worst enemy. He was paroled in Florida, but decided to violate his parole by going back and forth to New Jersey. On one of those trips, he got caught up and was arrested for a crime that happened on May 8, 1975. The crime was for robbery of 3 female drug dealers and the homicide of a drug trafficker named Everett at the Scudder Homes housing projects. Unfortunately for him, a witness saw a body being dragged and dumped from a car. That witness somehow just happened to be an Essex County corrections officer who just happened to be there at the time with a pen and paper to write down the license plate of the car. The license plate traced back to the car that was registered to yours truly, James Scott. James insisted to law enforcement that he loaned his car out to a friend and had nothing to do with a homicide. James would later go to trial, and although the jury could not reach a verdict on the murder charge, he would be convicted of the robbery and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Ruben and John were 9 years into their triple life sentence when in October 1975, Smokin' Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali got together to lead a march in protest for their wrongful arrest and sentencing. 2 months after the march, in December of 1975, Bob Dylan and Muhammad Ali would get together for a concert to bring awareness to the injustice against Ruben. The night of that concert would be known as the Night of the Hurricane. On November 21st, 1976, the movie Rocky premiered in New York City. It was a big deal and it inspired everyone across the country. Boxer Chuck Wepner, who also served time at Rahway in the 80s, also served as the inspiration for that movie. Over time, Dwight Braxton grew as a man and found himself, and after he was paroled around March 1978, at 25 years old he joined a temple in Camden, New Jersey, and changed his name from Dwight Braxton to Dwight Muhammad Quarry. He then himself became a professional fighter and started the next chapter of his life. That same year, a documentary was created in order to scare the shit out of juvenile delinquents with a purpose to deter them from living a life of crime. It was called Scared Straight, and it was filmed in Rahway. The first episode was narrated by Peter Falk, who played the most irritating TV detective of his time, Columbo.
I'ma tell you what happened to a young, tender motherfucker like you. That I had to clean my motherfucking cell, motherfucker. Wash my drawers and socks, motherfucker. What else happened? And you had to suck my motherfucking dick, motherfucker, when my dick get hard. You fuck, motherfucker. That's the shit that go on. Dump that shit too. Hold on, bitch.
Act like you got a fucking problem. That's what.
Let me tell you something else. Your name is Robin, motherfucker.
As a child, if that didn't scare you, nothing will. In October, James Scott would have one of the biggest nights of his career. He made history. His manager negotiated a fight with the #1 ranked light heavyweight in the world, Eddie the Flame Gregory. In the same auditorium where the riots took place, James, also known as inmate 57735, was ready. This was a big deal. It would be the first professional fight to ever be broadcasted from a prison. HBO Sports wanted in. They decided to broadcast the fight live with the headlines, "Boxing Behind Bars."
Here we are with my two colleagues, Don Dunphy, the well-known blow-by-blow announcer, and Sugar Ray Leonard, the welterweight contender.
James Scott is a devastating puncher, but as the rounds progress, you will see that Eddie Gregory's experience will take its toll.
Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please. The winner by unanimous decision, James Scott.
The fight lasted a full 12 rounds with James as the winner. James would go on to fight his professional opponents from behind bars. In 1981, Quarry would return to a place where he swore he would never go back, Rahway. On September 5th, he would fight against his old sparring partner, James Scott. Quarry proved too much of a match for James and would go on to win a unanimous decision, as James had other things on his mind, like the new trial for his old case at Scudder Homes. James was already serving 30 years for the robbery, but this time around he would be found guilty for the murder of Everett and sentenced to life in prison. At the end of that year, after serving 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, John Artis was paroled in December of 1981. In March 1983, Quarry would lose to Michael Spinks. The rematch was supposed to take place a year later, but things changed for Quarry. In '84, Quarry would go through a divorce, and his brother Lawrence Braxton was charged with homicide for using a pipe to break the arm and fracture the skull of their father. In '85, after serving 19 years for a crime he didn't commit, Rubin Carter was released from prison. The judge stated that the case was based on racism instead of reason. A year later, in March 1986, Quarry would get revenge against Michael Spinks by beating his brother, Leon Spinks. Just 4 months later, on July 12, 1986, after a 15-round fight, Holyfield would give Quarry his third professional loss, and in a split decision, Holyfield would become the new WBA World Junior Heavyweight Champion.
The weight pretty much the same, big height advantage for Holyfield, and with that comes a reach advantage of almost 6 inches. So ahead, live on Wide World of Sports, the 15-round Junior Heavyweight fight for Cowie's World Boxing Association title. Stay with us.
Big right that really stunned Kelly. He stuttered. But now, look at him. Still, fire left in his eyes and in some of his punches.
I think that was the experience. I think Dwight may know he has to knock him out. I think he might have thought the way to get him to come in wide open was to back up. And there's the final bell.
Immediately after the fight, Holyfield was sent to the doctors for a full examination when it was discovered he lost 15 pounds during the fight. Yes, 15 pounds. Many moons later, Holyfield was asked, "Who was the toughest guy you ever fought?" And he said,
I'm tough. But the harder, I think the right Muhammad Quarry. I'm like, but I'm like, shoot. I lost 15 pounds just by fighting that guy trying to keep him off of me.
The history of Rahway continued with a hip-hop group made up of sturdy men serving their time behind bars. Over the years, Rahway continued to solidify his name in popular culture through songs and movies like The Hurricane, starring Denzel Washington. Be sure to follow Gully TV on the Dribble podcast, available on all streaming sites. And visit the website, therealdribble.com, to pick up an autographed copy of Some Things I've Been Through, a Gully TV memoir predicated on his relationships with some of America's most notorious black gangsters and drug lords. This is Alan Evans from Big City Crime TV. Until next time, y'all keep it Gully. Peace.